Welcome, friends, to the APUSH Dig, where we will build together a critical understanding of U.S. history through analyzing the processes of change. Now that we've explored all the essential content of AP U.S. history, it's time for us to do some big picture review. Today, we turn our attention to the theme of society and culture. In what ways can we describe sociocultural change throughout the 9 time periods of U.S. history? At the outset of colonization of the Americas by the Europeans, we can connect the Columbian Exchange to sociocultural change. It wasn't just that European culture was 100% transplanted to North America. Instead, there was a collision of cultures between the indigenous, the European, and then, especially after 1619, African. The settlers come out of this collision as the dominant force. Therefore, their culture is the dominant culture. However, this culture, though always connected back to Britain, does not remain identical to British culture. It was reshaped in America. During colonial times, the settlers' bond back to Britain formed their tightest cultural connection. However, apart from that, there were interesting socio-cultural differences among the 13 colonies. Calvinism and the theory of predestination shaped the Puritan society of New England. These colonists believed they had the duty to create the model Christian society, their city upon a hill. A strict racial and social hierarchy developed in the southern colonies. After Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, laws were written across the southern colonies to keep white and black people separate and to protect the institution of slavery legally. The First Great Awakening's popularity in the colonies in the 1730s led to the emergence of evangelism in American history. Evangelicals are strict cultural conservatives. Some historians emphasize that the Great Awakening inspired colonists to question authority, and this leads to the next generation of colonists who were the independence-minded patriots. I think that's a historical stretch, though. The rhetoric of the American Revolution owes a large debt to the philosophy of the Enlightenment. The language of natural rights and social contracts are key to understanding the philosophy of the language of the Revolution. But we shouldn't believe that the majority of colonists were sitting in their beds reading John Locke's books at night. But the revolutionary elite were, and they were able to take Locke's messages and write them for the common colonist to read through the robust number of newspapers that were published and distributed through the colonies, proof of its high literacy rate. The Enlightenment language of the Declaration of Independence is obvious, but so are the glaring hypocrisies. All men are created equal, words crafted and supported by slave owners, not to mention the complete patriarchy of the time, which left women out of both the political and public realms. I believe it's very important to look at America's society, at the origin of the nation in this way. Though not as extreme as in Europe, there was a clear class hierarchy in the United States. Men without wealth could not even vote in this so-called democratic republic. Apart from class, it was a white supremacist society. Its racial hegemony perpetuated through its laws, its government, its media, and its churches. 100 years after the First Great Awakening, we have another set of massive religious revivals sweep through America, creatively titled the Second Great Awakening. But the effects here are clearly lead to some socio-cultural change, perhaps more so in the northern and western states than in the south, which supports the notion that Americans in the antebellum United States felt more allegiance and connection to their own regional identities than they did to national identity. We call this sectionalism. The Second Great Awakening is seen as the impetus for a number of social reform movements, including temperance, the abolition of slavery, and the beginning of a women's rights movement to challenge the patriarchy of American society. In time period 5, we see some new elements emerge in the socio-cultural identity of the U.S. First is manifest destiny and the notion of American exceptionalism. Second is the first real appearance of the xenophobia of American society. The nativist reaction against the influx of immigrants from Ireland and Germany will not be the last time we see anti-immigrant sentiments flare up in our nation's history. Our society completely fell apart along sectional lines in this period, and when it was put back together, slavery had finally been abolished. However, in examining Reconstruction and what followed, we see that though slavery had been abolished, white supremacy continued to thrive. In Gilded Age America, we see the massive industrialization, the urbanization, and the corporatization of American society. In this Gilded Age, great wealth was accumulated, not distributed. The wealth gap, which had always existed, now grew exponentially. The capitalist class linked arm in arm with both political parties to create the Gilded Age ruling class. The ideas of the ruling class are meant to protect their very own wealth and privilege. Thus, we see new sociocultural beliefs infiltrate American society. These include social Darwinism and the support for laissez-faire capitalism. The rags to riches American dream story gets implanted into American society in this period. Rather than remaining in southern states, segregation spreads throughout the US in this period, protecting by law two different Americas, one for white people and a second class status for everyone else. Nativism returns in the form of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Finally, in response to the massive immigration in this era to fill the factories with labor power, Americans become afraid that their culture will somehow be overtaken by the barbarians at the gates. So we see the beginning of a nationwide assimilation project known as Americanization. Time period 7 is a complicated one. American society goes through many major changes in this period. We could begin with the Progressive Era, where we see leaders turning towards scientific management, efficiency, and a devotion to rooting out corruption and expanding democracy in the US. We see first wave feminism emerge and push President Wilson into signing the 19th Amendment. In an era of extreme racist institutions of law and thought, we see black leaders challenge inequality in different ways. First, with the popularity of Booker T. Washington, next with W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP, and in the 1920s, we see Marcus Garvey and the New Negro movement. After World War I, the U.S. falls into its first Red Scare, allowing itself to be driven by hysteria and panic that radicals would overthrow the United States, when really, all anyone really wants is equality. The 1920s sees the U.S. enact its strictest immigration laws, known as the quota system. Meanwhile, an intense conflict is playing out in society. The allure of modernism on one side against the forces of conservative traditionalism on the other. Arising from the depths of the Great Depression came New Deal liberalism and the expansion of the social definition of the word freedom in America. With the US waging a war against racism and fascism, we had to reevaluate what freedom meant in the United States. Fighting in World War II inspired the Double V campaign for black soldiers, fighting against racism and fascism in Europe and Asia, and fighting against racism and segregation here in the US. The US shined triumphant after World War II, but society fell prey to a second Red Scare we know as the Cold War, the era of McCarthyism, of communist witch hunts, of conformity, of consumerism. Along with the Red Scare was the Lavender Scare, or a renewed persecution against the LGBTQ community. This began an era of newly revitalized patriarchy as women were forced out of the factories and back into the kitchens. This will inspire a second wave of feminism that will win important victories, such as a woman's right to choose in the case Roe v. Wade in 1973. Society erupted with the civil rights rebellions of this period. The civil rights rebellions inspired outbursts against oppression in all aspects of American culture. Some specific examples from the 1960s were the movement against the Vietnam War, the counterculture, and the New Left. The reaction against the chaos of the 1960s was the conservative silent majority that swept Richard Nixon into the White House in 1968. With the end of the racist immigration quotas in 1965, American society began to look radically different, welcoming immigrants from around the world, especially Asia and Africa. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 marks the beginning of a new time period in APUS history because of how emphatically it was a break with the society created by New Deal liberalism in period 7. Reagan's presidency is seen as a triumph of conservatism and of the policies of neoliberalism. Let's not confuse neoliberalism with New Deal liberalism. New Deal liberalism was the belief that the federal government had an important role to play in regulating businesses and the economy as a whole, and that a multifaceted welfare state would benefit all Americans. Neoliberalism is the opposite of that. Neoliberalism is a very conservative philosophy that seeks to turn every aspect of the economy and society into part of the free market, in a sense, to open everything up for business. Neoliberalism means cutting corporate taxes, it means slashing social spending. It means striking against regulatory agencies like the Environmental Protective Agency. It means attacking labor unions. It means defunding public education and allowing for charter schools to be managed by private corporations, sucking public funds away from public schools. Above all else, above all else, neoliberalism has convinced society that there is no alternative, that the free market and capitalism will improve our lives, and that big government will hurt us. This has become embedded in our culture ever since the 1980s. Politicians today, like Bernie Sanders and their platform, is the exact opposite of this Reaganite conservative neoliberalism. Our society today is very divided. The wealth gap is wider now than ever. Schools and neighborhoods in urban areas are more segregated now than they were in the 1960s. But our society is also divided by the culture wars. One peculiar thing about American society is that, unlike in Europe, we don't see class divisions erupt often. Instead, we see people take to the streets over cultural issues and ignore class issues. We see people marching with assault rifles to protect so called gun rights. We see people in the streets trying to take away a woman's right to make decisions over her own body. We have people exploding over same sex marriage or the rights of trans people. These are the culture wars. Also, ever since the 1980s, we've seen the borderization of politics, inspired by the racist nativism of American society and its irrational fears of immigrant invasions. Both political parties today call for tough regulations on immigration. Yes, we have the Republican President Trump today with his dream of a border wall, but 650 miles of border fencing was already erected by the Democrat Bill Clinton in the 90s. Some final thoughts. Our society has always been divided, religiously in colonial times, racially, by gender, by class. However, American exceptionalism, a powerful component of our socio-cultural identity, helps Americans to overlook or disregard societal differences. White supremacy has been the norm. It has always been challenged, but its legacy is still all around us today. Our society and culture have changed greatly since the founding of this nation. American society is more inclusive today than at any other point in our history. But let's never forget that that expansion of inclusivity in our nation is thanks to the struggles of the very groups of people who have faced the greatest levels of oppression in our history. We have them to thank. See you next time.